Today, we take you through one of the most shocking events recorded in the Philippines during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The morning of April 7th, 1945, began like any other at Camp O'Donnell in Capiz Tarlac Province. Canadian medical officer Captain Victoria Hayes completed her routine inspection of the makeshift hospital ward that had been established in the former Japanese detention facility. The compound, which had witnessed unspeakable suffering during the Bataan Death March 3 years earlier, now served as a processing center for liberated prisoners of war and displaced civilians. Captain Hayes noted in her daily log that 43 Japanese nurses remained under Allied custody in the eastern section of the camp. These women, ages ranging from 19 to 34, had been captured during the fall of Manila the previous month. According to military protocol, they were to undergo medical examination and interrogation before transfer to permanent detention facilities. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floors of Building 7, where the Japanese nurses sat in 2 parallel rows. Hayes observed their posture, back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed on the ground. In her medical assessment notes, she recorded that several showed signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. What she did not record was the unmistakable tension that filled the room whenever male personnel approached. At 0830 hours, Allied intelligence officers arrived to conduct the scheduled inspection. The procedure was standard: verification of identity, medical screening, and preliminary interrogation. However, records from that day reveal an unusual addition to the inspection protocol. Without explanation, the intelligence team requested that the nurses remove their outer garments for what was described as a security sweep. Nurse Hana Nakamura, 26 years old from Osaka Prefecture, sat in the 3rd row. Medical records later found in her personal effects indicated she had served at Manila General Hospital since 1943. Her diary, discovered months later during a routine cleaning of the facility, contained entries that provided insight into the events of that morning. The diary entry dated April 6th mentioned increased anxiety among the nurses regarding the upcoming inspection. Nakamura wrote that several of her colleagues had heard rumors from other prisoners about the nature of these examinations. The exact content of these rumors was never officially documented, though subsequent medical evaluations suggested the women anticipated treatment that extended beyond standard military protocol. Captain Hayes positioned herself near the entrance of Building 7 as the intelligence officers began their procedure. Her medical training had prepared her for many situations, but the atmosphere in that room prompted her to remain present throughout the inspection. Later testimony from Canadian medical personnel indicated this was not standard practice for such procedures. The intelligence officers proceeded methodically through their list. Names were called, documents examined, and preliminary questions asked through a Japanese interpreter. The process moved efficiently until the request was made for the nurses to stand and remove their outer uniforms for the security screening. What happened next was recorded in multiple witness statements, though the exact details vary depending on the source. According to Hayes's medical log, the nurses complied with the order but exhibited visible distress. Several began to tremble, and at least 2 collapsed before the examination could begin. The interpreter, a Nisei soldier from California named Staff Sergeant James Tanaka, later reported that one of the nurses whispered a single word in Japanese, mata. The word translates to again, though its context in that moment was never fully clarified in official reports. Captain Hayes made a decision that would be discussed in military circles for months afterward. She approached the supply closet and retrieved several wool blankets that had been stored for winter distribution. Without requesting permission from the intelligence officers, she began distributing these blankets to the nurses. The intelligence team protested that the blankets would interfere with the security screening. Hayes replied that medical protocol required maintaining patient dignity during examinations. This exchange was witnessed by at least 6 Allied personnel, though only 3 provided written statements about the incident. The blankets were olive drab wool, standard military issue, measuring approximately 5 feet by 7 feet. Hayes instructed the nurses through Sergeant Tanaka that they could drape these over themselves during the examination. The intelligence officers reluctantly agreed to modify their procedure to accommodate this arrangement. What followed was a medical examination that proceeded without incident. The security screening was completed with the nurses wrapped in the Canadian military blankets. No contraband was discovered, and no security threats were identified. The entire process took approximately 3 hours. However, the unusual nature of Hayes's intervention did not go unnoticed by military administration. Within 48 hours, she was summoned to meet with Colonel Robert Mackenzie, commanding officer of the Tarlac District Allied Forces. The meeting took place in his office at 1400 hours on April 9th. No official transcript exists of this meeting, though administrative records show that Hayes was questioned about her deviation from standard inspection protocol. Her written response, filed 2 days later, stated that she acted within her authority as Chief Medical Officer to ensure the physical and psychological welfare of prisoners under medical supervision. The response did not satisfy military administration. Colonel Mackenzie's aide-de-camp noted in the daily administrative log that the captain's actions had complicated established procedures and created precedent for unnecessary accommodation of enemy personnel. On April 12th, Hayes received new orders transferring her to a medical facility in Leyte, approximately 200 miles south of her current position. The transfer was described as routine reassignment to meet operational requirements, though medical personnel familiar with the case later suggested other motivations. Sergeant Tanaka, the interpreter present during the incident, was also reassigned within the week. His new posting sent him to intelligence operations in northern Luzon, effectively removing him from any potential follow-up investigations regarding the April 7th inspection. The Japanese nurses remained at Camp O'Donnell for 6 additional weeks before their eventual transfer to permanent detention facilities in Manila. During this period, no further incidents were reported during their routine medical examinations. However, camp administrative records note that blankets became standard issue for all prisoner medical procedures following the April incident. Nurse Nakamura's diary, discovered during the facility closure in August 1945, contained entries that provided additional context for the events. Her writing described the morning of April 7th as the day when the Canadian doctor showed us that not all soldiers were the same. The diary also revealed details about the nurses' previous experiences that helped explain their reaction to the inspection order. References to examinations conducted at Manila General Hospital during Japanese occupation suggested a pattern of treatment that extended beyond medical necessity. These entries were later classified and removed from the publicly available records. Captain Hayes's transfer to Leyte proved temporary. Military medical records show that she served there for only 6 weeks before receiving orders to return to Canada. Her departure from the Philippines occurred on May 28, 1945, several weeks earlier than scheduled for most Canadian medical personnel. The official reason cited administrative needs in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where Hayes was reassigned to Veteran Rehabilitation Services. However, correspondence between Medical Command and Administrative Headquarters suggested that her early departure was related to what one memo described as attitude incompatible with theater requirements. Hayes' personnel file, partially declassified decades later, contained a note from Colonel Mackenzie stating that while her medical skills were beyond question, her tendency to prioritize humanitarian concerns over military efficiency made her unsuitable for continued service in occupied territory. The incident report filed by the intelligence officers who conducted the April 7th inspection made no mention of the blanket distribution or Hayes's intervention. Their official documentation described the procedure as routine security screening completed without incident. The discrepancy between this report and witness accounts was never officially addressed. Sergeant Tanaka's final report as interpreter noted that the Japanese nurses' cooperation improved significantly after April 7th. He attributed this to establishment of clear expectations and appropriate medical oversight. His recommendation that similar protocols be implemented at other facilities was not acted upon. The fate of the 43 nurses after their transfer from Camp O'Donnell remained largely undocumented. Military records indicate they were moved to civilian detention facilities in Manila, but individual tracking ceased at that point. Post-war repatriation lists suggest that 37 returned to Japan in late 1945, though 6 names were never accounted for. Nurse Nakamura's name appeared on a repatriation manifest dated November 15, 1945. Her destination was listed as Osaka Prefecture, where family records indicate she returned to civilian nursing. However, attempts to locate her or other nurses from the April incident for post-war interviews were unsuccessful. The wool blankets used during the inspection became part of a larger administrative discussion about prisoner treatment protocols. A memo dated April 21, 1945, from Headquarters Allied Forces Southwest Pacific referenced the incident as an example of irregular but potentially beneficial modifications to standard procedure. This memo recommended review of current prisoner examination protocols, particularly regarding female detainees. The review was initiated but never completed due to the end of hostilities in August 1945. Post-war documentation suggests that recommended changes were never implemented in official military doctrine. Captain Hayes's service record after her return to Canada showed continued dedication to medical practice. She served at veteran rehabilitation centers in Halifax and later Montreal until her retirement in 1952. Her personnel evaluations consistently rated her as an exceptional medical officer, though they noted her strong advocacy for patient welfare sometimes conflicted with administrative requirements. In 1948, Hayes was contacted by researchers compiling documentation about Canadian medical services in the Pacific Theatre. She provided detailed responses about her general service, but declined to discuss specific incidents involving prisoner treatment. Her written statement simply noted that medical ethics required the same standard of care regardless of nationality or circumstances. The Camp O'Donnell facility was gradually decommissioned through late 1945 and early 1946. During the closure process, maintenance crews discovered various personal items left behind by former occupants, including Nakamura's diary and several letters written by other nurses. These materials were initially collected for potential intelligence value, but were ultimately filed in archives without analysis. The diary was discovered by researchers in 1944, though portions dealing with sensitive medical and personal matters remained classified until much later. Administrative records from the final weeks of Camp O'Donnell showed that the blanket protocol established after the April incident had become standard practice for all medical examinations. Supply manifests indicated regular requisition of additional blankets specifically designated for medical examination procedures. The influence of Hayes's intervention extended beyond the immediate incident. Medical personnel who served at O'Donnell later reported that the April 7th events were frequently discussed among staff as an example of balancing military requirements with humanitarian considerations. Several noted that the incident influenced their own approach to prisoner medical care. Colonel Mackenzie's final report on the administration of Camp O'Donnell, filed in September 1945, made brief reference to procedural modifications implemented to improve prisoner cooperation during medical examinations. The report noted that these modifications had resulted in improved efficiency and reduced incidents during routine procedures. However, Mackenzie's report did not elaborate on the nature of these modifications or their origin. The connection between the April incident and subsequent policy changes was never explicitly documented in official records, though the timing and nature of the changes suggested a clear relationship. Staff Sergeant Tanaka's post-war correspondence with other Nisei veterans occasionally referenced his service as an interpreter at prisoner facilities. In a letter to his family dated 1947, he mentioned an incident where a Canadian doctor taught us about treating people with dignity even during wartime. The letter did not provide additional details about specific events. The broader implications of the April 7th incident were reflected in military medical discussions throughout the remainder of 1945. Medical officers at other facilities reported receiving informal guidance about maintaining appropriate medical standards during prisoner examinations, though no formal policy changes were issued. Research conducted decades later by military historians noted that the Camp O'Donnell incident represented one of several examples where individual medical officers took initiative to modify established procedures based on humanitarian concerns. These historians noted that such incidents were rarely documented in official records, making comprehensive analysis difficult. The psychological impact on the Japanese nurses extended well beyond their time in Allied custody. Post-war interviews with Japanese medical personnel who served in the Philippines revealed widespread anxiety about treatment during capture and detention. Several former nurses reported that stories about examinations had circulated widely among medical staff during the occupation period. These interviews suggested that the April 7th incident at Camp O'Donnell, while not widely known in its specific details, represented a significant departure from expected treatment. The use of blankets during the examination was described by one former nurse as the first time someone treated us like human beings rather than enemy property. The documentation surrounding Captain Hayes's intervention raised questions about the broader treatment of female prisoners during the Pacific Campaign. Military medical records from other facilities showed varying approaches to prisoner examinations, though most lacked the detailed documentation available for the O'Donnell incident. Administrative correspondence between medical and intelligence commands revealed ongoing tension about the balance between security requirements and medical ethics in prisoner treatment. Several memos from spring 1945 indicated that the O'Donnell incident was used as a case study in discussions about appropriate procedures. The ultimate fate of the blankets themselves became part of the administrative record. Supply inventories from Camp O'Donnell's closure indicated that 47 wool blankets were designated as medical equipment and transferred to other facilities rather than returned to general supply. This designation was unusual for standard-issue blankets and suggested recognition of their specialized use. Captain Hayes's medical philosophy, as revealed through her post-war writings and interviews, emphasized the universal nature of medical ethics regardless of political circumstances. In a 1951 address to Canadian medical students, she stated that the principles of medical care recognize no nationality, only human need. The incident also highlighted the role of interpreters in sensitive military situations. Sergeant Tanaka's presence and his careful translation of the nurse's concerns played a crucial role in Hayes' understanding of the situation. Post-war analysis of interpreter services noted that cultural understanding was as important as linguistic skills in such circumstances. Military medical training programs in the post-war period incorporated lessons learned from incidents like the one at Camp O'Donnell. Training materials emphasized the importance of maintaining medical ethics while fulfilling security requirements, though specific case studies were rarely identified by name or location. The Japanese nurses' experience at O'Donnell reflected broader patterns of treatment for medical personnel captured during the Pacific Campaign. Military records indicated that medical captives were generally housed separately from combat prisoners, though examination and interrogation procedures varied significantly between facilities. Research into post-war repatriation records suggested that many former prisoners, particularly women, faced significant challenges readjusting to civilian life. Several studies noted that treatment during captivity influenced long-term psychological recovery, though direct correlations were difficult to establish due to limited documentation. The Camp O'Donnell incident remained largely unknown outside military medical circles until declassification of related documents decades later. Even then, the full story was pieced together from multiple sources, as no single comprehensive account existed in official records. Captain Hayes' decision to distribute blankets represented a split-second judgment call that had far-reaching consequences for prisoner treatment protocols. Military analysts later noted that such individual initiatives, while sometimes creating administrative complications, often reflected deeper ethical considerations that formal procedures failed to address. The timing of the incident, occurring just months before the end of the war, meant that its immediate impact was limited to the specific facility. However, the principles it represented would influence post-war discussions about prisoner treatment and medical ethics in military contexts for years to come. The story of the Japanese nurses and the Canadian medical officer who covered them with blankets became part of the complex legacy of the Pacific Theater. It illustrated both the brutality that characterized much of the conflict and the individual acts of humanity that occurred even within the harsh realities of wartime detention. The documentation available for this incident, while incomplete, provides insight into the daily decisions faced by medical personnel in occupied territory. These decisions often required balancing military orders with medical ethics, sometimes creating conflicts that individual officers had to resolve in real time without clear guidance. The influence of cultural understanding in the incident cannot be understated. Captain Hayes' recognition of the nurse's distress and her response to it suggested an awareness of their vulnerability that went beyond standard medical assessment. This cultural sensitivity was not always present in military medical situations, making her intervention particularly significant. The administrative aftermath of the incident revealed the tension between individual initiative and military procedure. While Hayes' actions were ultimately supported by medical necessity, the controversy they generated illustrated the challenges faced by medical officers who deviated from established protocols, even for humanitarian reasons. The story also highlighted the importance of witness testimony in documenting wartime events. Without the multiple accounts from Canadian medical personnel and Sergeant Tanaka's observations, the incident might have been lost entirely to administrative records that provided only sanitized versions of events. The 43 Japanese nurses became symbols of the broader civilian population caught between military forces during the Pacific Campaign. Their treatment at Camp O'Donnell, particularly the April 7th incident, represented both the vulnerability of non-combatant medical personnel and the potential for individual acts of compassion within military systems. Captain Hayes's intervention, while brief in duration, had lasting implications for how prisoner medical examinations were conducted at the facility. The blanket protocol she established informally became formal procedure, suggesting that individual ethical stands could influence broader policy when circumstances allowed. The incident also illustrated the complex role of female medical personnel in wartime situations. Both Captain Hayes and the Japanese nurses navigated military environments that were predominantly male, facing challenges and vulnerabilities specific to their gender while attempting to fulfill their medical duties. The documentation surrounding this event provides a rare glimpse into the human dimensions of military administration during wartime. The careful balance between security requirements and humanitarian concerns played out in real time, with individual officers making decisions that would affect both immediate circumstances and longer-term policies. The story of the blankets at Camp O'Donnell ultimately represents the possibility for individual conscience to influence institutional behavior even within highly regulated military systems. Captain Hayes's recognition of the nurse's distress and her response to it demonstrated that medical ethics could transcend national boundaries and military hierarchies when individual officers chose to act on their professional and moral obligations. The legacy of this incident extended beyond its immediate participants to influence discussions about prisoner treatment, medical ethics, and cultural sensitivity in military contexts. While the specific details remained largely unknown for decades, the principles it represented continued to inform medical military practice long after the end of the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese nurses who experienced this brief moment of compassion returned to a Japan devastated by war, carrying with them the memory of a Canadian doctor who chose to see them as patients rather than prisoners. For Captain Hayes, the incident represented the intersection of medical duty and human decency that would define her approach to veteran care for the remainder of her career. In the broader context of Pacific theater history, the Camp O'Donnell blanket incident serves as a reminder that individual actions, even small ones, could provide humanity within the larger machinery of war. The decision to distribute blankets during a routine examination became a testament to the power of individual conscience to transcend the boundaries imposed by conflict and nationality. The administrative records and personal accounts that documented this event provide insight into the daily moral choices faced by military personnel during wartime. Captain Hayes' intervention illustrated that ethical decisions often required immediate action without the luxury of consultation or official approval, and that medical officers sometimes had to choose between strict adherence to procedure and their understanding of appropriate patient care. The story remains incomplete, with many questions about the long-term fate of the nurses and the broader implications of the incident left unanswered. However, the available documentation provides sufficient detail to understand the significance of what occurred that April morning in 1945, when a Canadian medical officer chose compassion over convenience. The Camp O'Donnell incident stands as one of many small acts of humanity that occurred within the larger framework of the Pacific War. While it may not have changed the course of military strategy or altered major policies, it represented the possibility for individual conscience to make a difference in the lives of those caught between opposing forces during one of history's most destructive conflicts. The blankets distributed that morning served a practical purpose in maintaining patient dignity during a medical examination. But they also served a symbolic function, representing the recognition of shared humanity even between former enemies. This recognition transcended the immediate military context and spoke to broader principles about how individuals should be treated, regardless of their nationality or circumstances. Captain Hayes's intervention at Camp O'Donnell demonstrates that significant acts of compassion need not be grand gestures to have meaningful impact. Sometimes the most important humanitarian actions are simple responses to immediate human need, carried out by individuals who recognize their moral obligations regardless of official procedures or potential consequences. The documentation of this incident provides valuable insight into the complex interplay between individual conscience and institutional authority during wartime. Captain Hayes's decision to distribute blankets represented a moment when personal ethics overrode administrative convenience, creating a precedent that would influence subsequent prisoner treatment at the facility. The Japanese nurses who benefited from this intervention experienced a brief but significant moment when their dignity was recognized and protected by an enemy medical officer. This experience, documented in recovered personal writings, provided a counterpoint to the generally harsh treatment they had experienced during their capture and detention. The story of the blankets at Camp O'Donnell ultimately illustrates the power of individual choice in shaping human experience during wartime. Captain Hayes's decision to act on her medical and ethical training created a moment of humanity within the broader context of military detention, demonstrating that individual conscience could transcend the boundaries imposed by war and nationality. The administrative and personal records surrounding this incident provide a rare, detailed look at how humanitarian principles could be implemented within military systems when individual officers chose to prioritize ethical considerations over procedural convenience. The long-term influence of this decision extended well beyond the immediate participants to affect policies and attitudes about prisoner treatment throughout the remainder of the conflict. In the final analysis, the Camp O'Donnell blanket incident represents both the potential for individual compassion within institutional frameworks and the ongoing tension between military necessity and humanitarian concern. Captain Hayes' intervention demonstrated that medical ethics could transcend national boundaries when individual officers chose to act on their professional obligations rather than simply following established procedures. The legacy of this event continues to inform discussions about medical ethics, prisoner treatment, and cultural sensitivity in military contexts. While the immediate participants have largely passed from historical record, the principles they embodied remain relevant to contemporary discussions about maintaining humanitarian standards within military operations. The story of the 43 Japanese nurses and the Canadian doctor who covered them with blankets serves as a reminder that individual acts of compassion, however small, can provide moments of humanity within the larger framework of armed conflict. These moments, while brief, often carry significance far beyond their immediate duration, influencing both those who experience them and the broader systems within which they occur. Today, more than 75 years after the events at Camp O'Donnell, the incident remains a testament to the power of individual conscience to transcend the boundaries imposed by war and nationality. Captain Hayes's decision to distribute blankets during a routine medical examination created a legacy of compassion that extended well beyond the immediate circumstances, influencing policies and attitudes about prisoner treatment for years to come. The incomplete documentation surrounding this event reflects the broader challenge of preserving the human stories that occurred within the larger narrative of the Pacific War. Many individual acts of compassion and conscience went unrecorded, lost to the administrative focus on strategic and tactical matters rather than personal experiences. However, the available records provide sufficient detail to understand the significance of what occurred that morning in 1945, when a Canadian medical officer chose to prioritize patient dignity over procedural efficiency. This choice created a moment of humanity that resonated far beyond its immediate context, demonstrating the ongoing relevance of individual ethical action within institutional frameworks. The Camp O'Donnell incident serves as both historical documentation and contemporary reminder about the importance of maintaining humanitarian principles even within the constraints of military necessity. Captain Hayes's intervention illustrated that individual conscience could create positive change when officers chose to act on their professional and moral obligations rather than simply following established procedures. The story concludes not with dramatic revelation, but with the quiet recognition that individual acts of compassion, properly documented and understood, can provide insight into both the challenges and possibilities of maintaining humanitarian standards during armed conflict. The blankets distributed that April morning served their immediate practical purpose, but also created a legacy of recognition for shared human dignity that transcended the immediate circumstances of war. The records filed at Allied Headquarters Southwest Pacific in October 1945 included a final administrative note about the Camp O'Donnell medical protocols. The note, signed by Colonel Mackenzie's replacement, stated that modified examination procedures implemented in April 1945 resulted in 0 incidents during subsequent prisoner medical evaluations. This bureaucratic language concealed the human reality of what those modifications meant. For 6 months, every medical examination of female prisoners at the facility included the distribution of blankets as standard procedure. The protocol spread to other detention centers throughout the Philippines, though the original reason for its implementation was rarely explained in official documentation. Captain Hayes' personnel file, closed upon her return to Canada, contained a final evaluation from her commanding officer in Leyte. The assessment noted her exceptional medical skills and unwavering commitment to patient welfare, but also mentioned her tendency to interpret medical protocols liberally when patient dignity was concerned. The evaluation concluded with a recommendation that Hayes be assigned to roles where her humanitarian instincts could be channeled productively within established administrative frameworks. This recommendation guided her post-war assignments to veteran rehabilitation services, where her approach to patient care would face fewer institutional conflicts. Sergeant Tanaka's final report as interpreter at Camp O'Donnell included a paragraph that would be referenced in later military studies of interpreter services. He noted that successful communication between former enemies required understanding not just language, but cultural context, particularly regarding concepts of dignity and respect. His observation that the April 7th incident had improved cooperation and reduced anxiety among Japanese medical personnel became part of training materials for military interpreters in subsequent conflicts. The lesson that cultural sensitivity could enhance security effectiveness rather than compromise it influenced interpreter protocols for decades. The 43 Japanese nurses were eventually processed through repatriation centers in Manila during late 1945. Military records show that 37 returned to Japan aboard transport vessels in November and December. 6 names disappeared from official documentation, their fates unknown. Among the repatriated nurses, Hana Nakamura's name appeared on the manifest of the transport vessel Takasago Maru, which departed Manila on November 22, 1945. The ship's passenger list noted her destination as Osaka Prefecture, where family records indicate she resumed civilian nursing at a tuberculosis sanatorium. Nakamura's diary, recovered from Camp O'Donnell, was eventually returned to her family through Red Cross channels in 1947. The final entry, dated April 10, 1945, contained a single sentence that summarized her experience. Today I learned that kindness exists even between enemies. The wool blankets that had served as symbols of dignity during the April examinations were eventually distributed to other medical facilities as the camp closed. Supply records indicate that several were sent to field hospitals treating wounded Allied personnel, where they continued to serve patients regardless of nationality. Captain Hayes maintained correspondence with several colleagues who had served at Camp O'Donnell until her retirement in 1952. These letters, preserved in private collections, occasionally reference the April incident as an example of how individual initiative could improve standard procedures. In a letter dated 1951, Hayes wrote to a former colleague, "I have often wondered if those Japanese nurses remembered that morning as clearly as I do. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight, particularly when they occur between people who have every reason to distrust each other." The administrative legacy of the incident extended beyond the immediate participants. A training manual published by the Canadian Army Medical Corps in 1948 included a section on maintaining medical ethics in hostile environments. The section emphasized that medical personnel must uphold professional standards regardless of patient nationality or political circumstances. The manual's guidance that patient dignity must be preserved during all medical procedures, even when security concerns are present, reflected lessons learned from incidents like the one at Camp O'Donnell. Military medical training programs developed after the war incorporated case studies about balancing security requirements with patient care. Though specific incidents were rarely identified by name or location. Though not explicitly referenced, the influence of Hayes' intervention was evident in the training protocols. Colonel Mackenzie's final assessment of the Camp O'Donnell operations, filed before his own transfer in September 1945, included a recommendation that flexible interpretation of medical examination procedures should be standard policy when dealing with female prisoners. The recommendation was noted, but not formally implemented in military regulations. The incident remained largely unknown outside military medical circles until declassification of related documents in the 1970s. Even then, the story was pieced together from scattered administrative records, personal correspondence, and recovered diaries rather than comprehensive official documentation. Research conducted by military historians in the 1980s identified the Camp O'Donnell incident as one of several examples where individual medical officers had modified established procedures based on humanitarian concerns. These modifications were rarely documented in official records, making comprehensive study difficult. The historians noted that such incidents illustrated the ongoing tension between military efficiency and medical ethics, particularly in prisoner treatment situations. Individual officers like Captain Hayes were often forced to make immediate decisions about how to balance competing obligations without clear guidance from superior commands. Captain Hayes herself declined most requests for interviews about her wartime service, preferring to let her medical work speak for itself. In one of the few public statements she made about the Pacific Theater, she told a Canadian medical journal in 1953, "War creates situations where medical personnel must choose between procedures and principles. I believe principles should always prevail." The broader implications of the Camp O'Donnell incident influenced post-war discussions about prisoner treatment and medical ethics in military contexts. Though the specific details remained largely classified, the principles it represented informed policy discussions for years after the conflict ended. The story of the Japanese nurses and the Canadian medical officer who covered them with blankets ultimately represents the possibility for individual conscience to transcend the boundaries imposed by war and nationality. Captain Hayes's recognition of shared humanity in a moment of vulnerability created a precedent that influenced prisoner treatment protocols throughout the remainder of the conflict. The documentation surrounding this incident provides valuable insight into the daily moral choices faced by military medical personnel during wartime. These choices often required immediate action based on professional ethics rather than administrative convenience, demonstrating the ongoing relevance of individual moral courage within institutional frameworks. The legacy of the April 7th incident at Camp O'Donnell continues to inform contemporary discussions about maintaining humanitarian standards within military operations. The recognition that individual acts of compassion, however small, can create meaningful change remains relevant to modern military medical practice. The incomplete nature of the historical record surrounding this event reflects the broader challenge of preserving individual human stories within the larger narrative of armed conflict. Many acts of compassion and conscience went unrecorded, lost to the administrative focus on strategic rather than personal matters. However, the available documentation provides sufficient detail to understand the significance of what occurred when a Canadian medical officer chose to prioritize patient dignity over procedural efficiency. This choice created a moment of humanity that resonated far beyond its immediate context, demonstrating the enduring power of individual, ethical action. The 43 Japanese nurses who experienced this brief recognition of their dignity carried the memory with them as they returned to a devastated homeland. For them, the incident represented proof that compassion could exist even between former enemies, providing hope for reconciliation in the post-war world. Captain Victoria Hayes continued her medical practice in Canada until her retirement, never fully understanding how her split-second decision to distribute blankets had influenced military medical protocols throughout the Pacific Theater. Her intervention at Camp O'Donnell remained one of countless individual acts that shaped the human experience of the Second World War. The wool blankets that covered the Japanese nurses during their examination in April 1945 served their immediate practical purpose and then passed into history. However, the principle they represented, that human dignity must be preserved even in the most challenging circumstances, continued to influence how medical personnel approached their duties long after the war ended. Today, the story of Camp O'Donnell serves as a reminder that individual ethical choices can create lasting change within institutional systems. Captain Hayes's intervention demonstrated that medical personnel could uphold professional standards while fulfilling military obligations, creating precedents that benefited countless prisoners throughout the remainder of the conflict. The incident ultimately illustrates that the most significant humanitarian actions are often the simplest. A recognition of shared vulnerability and a response based on professional ethics rather than political considerations. The Canadian medical officer who chose compassion over convenience created a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of one April morning in 1945.